Beneath the junction of Tottenham Court Road and New Oxford Street, where West End crowds move without pausing, stands a theatre. It opened in 1929, but the ground it stands on was once the site of the Horse Shoe Brewery, and on 17 October 1814, that brewery produced the London beer flood, one of Britain's strangest and most lethal industrial disasters. The brewery had hosted musicals and spectacles of its own kind for nearly a century before the theatre replaced it. Most of the people who pass through its doors today have no idea what occupied that ground before it. Most have no idea what unfolded there on that October afternoon in 1814. 8 people lost their lives. A neighbourhood drowned. And when the inquest closed 2 days later, the jury determined that nobody bore responsibility. Not the brewery, not its managers, not the man who examined the failing equipment 1 hour before it gave way and was told to file a note rather than act. 8 people were gone, and the official record called it Misfortune. This is the story of Meux and Company's Horse Shoe Brewery, of the industrial ambition that raised one of London's great porter works, and of the afternoon that ambition tore apart at a rusted iron hoop and poured through the walls of the city's poorest streets. But that is the end. The beginning is smaller and quieter. The Horse Shoe Brewery had occupied Tottenham Court Road since 1764, a porterhouse in the era when porter was the drink of working London. Dark, sustaining, cheap enough to reach the labourers and street sellers and Irish immigrants pressed into the Rookery of St Giles directly behind its walls, a district so dense with displaced Irish families that it had earned the street names Little Ireland and, among its own inhabitants, the Holy Land. William Hogarth had fixed a version of that same neighbourhood into permanent cultural memory in 1751 with Gin Lane, a print that mapped the ruin wrought by cheap spirits on exactly these streets. By the time Sir Henry Meux acquired the Horse Shoe in 1807, following a dispute that ended his partnership at the Griffin Brewery in Clerkenwell, where he had built his initial reputation as a porterman of serious means, the Horse Shoe was already a serious concern. He arrived with capital, expertise, and an appetite for scale that would define the following decade. What he constructed was formidable. By 1811, the brewery turned out more than 100,000 barrels of porter a year, placing it 6th among London's great porterhouses, behind giants like Truman, Hanbury and Buxton in Spitalfields, and Whitbread on Chiswell Street, and Barclay Perkins south of the river, the firms that between them had transformed porter from Ralph Harwood's original invention at the Bell Brewhouse in Shoreditch into a London industry of almost incomprehensible scale. Visitors in 1812 described Vats at the Horse Shoe of almost incomprehensible size. One stretched 70 feet across, capable of containing 18,000 barrels, its iron hoops alone weighing 80 tons. It was said that 200 people once sat down to dinner inside a newly inaugurated vat at a Meux-linked brewery, a theatre of industrial pride dressed up as a banquet. The Horse Shoe was not simply making beer, it was making a declaration that London's thirst was an engineering problem and that Meux and Company had answered it. Then came the iron hoops, the wooden fermentation vats that defined early 19th century porter brewing were immense, heavy, and under constant lateral pressure from the liquid they held. Iron hoops kept the staves bound. Those hoops slipped. They slipped at the Horse Shoe Brewery repeatedly, several times a year, and the practice that had grown up around this recurring fault involved neither draining the vessel nor halting production. The fault was logged. A repair was scheduled for a convenient moment. Still producing, still fermenting, still profitable. The toleration of failure had been quietly woven into the daily routine. On the afternoon of 17 October 1814, a storehouse clerk named George Crick inspected one of the large porter vats and found that a 700-pound iron hoop had slipped from its position. He recorded it. His supervisor directed him to draft a formal request for later repair. He did so. Roughly 1 hour after that exchange, at around 5:30 in the evening, the vat gave way. What followed bore no resemblance to a spill. The force of the escaping liquid struck a neighbouring vessel, dislodged its valve, and triggered a cascade. A wave estimated at 15 feet demolished the brewery's rear wall, throwing bricks onto rooftops in adjacent streets, then drove into the St Giles Rookery, carrying everything the brewery had been holding. The neighbourhood it struck ranked among the most crowded in London. The lanes were narrow. Drainage barely existed. The houses had been divided into tenements, their cellars occupied by families. The wave found all of it. Mary Banfield and her daughter Hannah were taking tea. They did not survive. In a house on New Street, 5 people had gathered for the wake of a 2-year-old boy named John Saville, already buried. The flood reached them too. Eleanor Cooper, a teenage servant at the Tavistock Arms public house, lost her life when the building's wall collapsed inward. 8 people in total. Women and children. Every one of them. The people of the St Giles Rookery. The people who drank porter because it was all they could afford, taken by the vats that produced it. In the hours that followed, neighbours moved through the flooded streets collecting beer in pots, hats, and whatever vessels came to hand. The smell of it, witnesses recorded, clung to the district for months. The inquest convened on 19 October 1814 at St Giles Workhouse rather than a court of law, reportedly because the disaster had already drawn hostile attention in the London press. The jury heard the evidence. They heard about George Crick and the slipped hoop. They heard about the cascade of failing vessels. They returned their verdict. The 8 had died casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. An act of God. No person, no company, no decision held to account. The excise framework that governed the brewery trade, the same system of beer duties and rebates that Parliament administered through its Excise Acts, would prove far more responsive to the brewery's losses than any legal mechanism proved to the families of the dead. Meux and Company offered no compensation to the families of the dead. Those families also lost their homes and what little they possessed. The brewery, for its part, had absorbed losses of approximately £23,000 and came close to ruin. Parliament granted it a rebate on the excise duty already paid on the destroyed beer, along with a further compensatory sum. The state moved to protect the firm. The firm moved to protect nobody. The prevailing historical account holds that the disaster constituted a foreseeable industrial failure, that the recurring slippage of the iron hoops was a known and documented fault, and that the decision not to act on Crick's inspection represented a meaningful operational cause. A secondary account holds that the scale of porter-vat technology had simply outrun what any engineer of that era could safely manage, and that the verdict reflected genuine uncertainty rather than institutional indifference. Both accounts rest on the same set of facts. 8 dead, no liability, a government bailout, and the brewery still standing. The London beer flood remains one of the most documented cases of unaccountable industrial death in British history, and one of its most forgotten. Meux and Company continued producing porter for more than a century after 1814. The Horse Shoe Brewery closed in 1921, came down in 1922. The firm itself endured in various merged forms until 1966, the brand dissolving into allied breweries and vanishing entirely in 1999. The Dominion Theatre opened on the site in 1929. It carries a Grade 2 listing. It runs tonight, as it has run for nearly 100 years, above the ground where the wave began, above the streets where 8 people lost their lives to a slipped iron hoop and a note that went unacted upon. The audiences arrive and depart and do not know. The weight of it sits in the ground beneath them, still and unacknowledged and very quiet.